I need to offer a twofold set of thanks to Lydia this evening, not only, as always, for her technical wizardry, but for her really very beautiful, stunning presentation last week. I think that all of us benefited first from, of course, having the honor and privilege of getting to know Lydia a bit better, since she's largely, literally behind the scenes and behind the screen. So we don't often get that opportunity. And secondly, because the perspective of somebody who had a Jewish experience that I would dare say is quite different, radically different even than most of ours growing up, offers a perspective that I think is very, very significant, very fresh, and highlights the idea of how one chooses in a very clear and steadfast way what it means to be Jewish. And I see it as an invitation for all of us in some measure to see ourselves as Jews by choice and how to be Jewish and what, by extension, Judaism means when we say, this is what resonates for me as a Jew. So thank you so much, Lydia. Appreciate it so much. We are going to tonight try to pull some strands together. We're going to be revisiting some themes from earlier last 2 weeks, but also touch on some additional and newer elements that I hope will allow us, again, first and foremost, to clarify for ourselves, to push our thinking and our experience forward in trying to really articulate for ourselves what this whole enterprise of being Jewish is all about, the implications of what that means, how we view this thing we call Judaism or Judaism, as we've been saying, so that we can have a chance to talk to each other about it. And we can have a chance to build, frankly, a community or communities that will allow us to thrive and know that we are not alone and can certainly benefit from the experience of joining with other people to know the joy of sharing what our Jewish journeys are all about. So we're going to go ahead this evening, and we're going to take a little bit of a different set of starting points in some respects. So we're going to go to something familiar first. If you can go to the next screen. This is the slide that we've been looking at a lot. It is by no means exhaustive. It's by no means necessarily complete on any level, but it is something that I think might suggest to us a set of ideas and approaches that are common for a number of people who find themselves saying, yes, I do identify Jewishly. It doesn't mean that you can have only one by any means, but I offer this once again to ask what really evokes something of an interest, if not excitement, I hope, in you. Yeah, that's really me. Number 2, number 7, number 4, I'm picking arbitrary numbers, are very, very significant. And this is a starting point for me. And if you will, it's kind of like the beginning of a project of weaving, so that once I have my start, I could see what other things ought to be woven into it. But the starting point might remain somewhat stable over the course of time. And what this really does is invite something that I think is significant in a broader way, and I think gives us a sort of a unique Jewish angle as well. And it's really the whole question of identity in the first place. A writer by the name of Anais Nin has said, we do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And it's almost impossible to separate in any significant way our biographies from our evaluations of what we see before us. Two people can see the exact same phenomenon and report it in very, very different terms. Lord knows we see that in the political realm these days. But I think it's true in terms of just the give and take of our ordinary, mundane, if you will, lives, any ordinary day in the course of our walking through this world. And that becomes a very significant thing. I want us, if we could at this point, take a look at something that is a part of a broader way of looking at religious identity, and to understand what it is elucidating, and see what it might suggest to us for our own experience of our tradition. I don't think it's limited to religious faith per se, but it's oriented that way, as you'll see, for a reason. Next slide, please. Okay, please do not be put off by these terms that are by no means in any way naturally understandable. But I'm pretty sure that most of us at a certain point in our lives probably came across the writings of Piaget, who suggested that there are certain stages that a child goes through in order to reach maturity. This basic general move from very, very concrete kinds of and sensory kinds of experiences. Every time Nancy and I are privileged to see our grandson at work, we want to remind him of where things are. We say, you haven't been reading your Piaget lately. This is the way it should be taking place. But he's doing what babies are supposed to do with respect to exploring and sensing the world and being stunned and amazed by the most, for us, typical kinds of phenomena. A ceiling fan or a light for a baby can be just heaven and can be a source of great and remarkable joy. And as a child grows, there is a greater capacity to think abstractly. First of all, to know that one's parents still exist, even if they cannot be seen, and ultimately to be able to come to certain understandings of self, separate from mother, separate from father. And that's the road to adulthood. So other people have taken up this basic notion and said, well, you know what? It applies elsewhere. Lawrence Kohlberg, with some controversy, applied it to moral reasoning. At the lowest levels, and he had a variety of stages for this too, at the lowest levels, we're moral in the sense that we obey rules because there's punishment if we don't. There are consequences. And as we get older and older and more wise, ultimately we get to a place where it's internalized and we don't do it for any external reward. We do what we think is the right thing. He doesn't define what the right thing should be. It's what we think is the right thing. And it's purely because of an internalized sense of who we are and what we think is right. So what about religion? What about religious identity? Now, Fowler gives us what I think is something interesting along those lines. I would suggest that he is primarily operating from a Christian perspective because he is taking a look at the experience of faith as something, as a phenomenon unto itself. Moving from something that is, again, very what he would consider primitive, which is, here are the rules that your religion tells you should follow. And in successive years, one comes to question them or to be reflective about them or to say, well, maybe I don't quite believe that, or maybe I can combine that with this experience. And then most people, if they're lucky, get to number 5. That's number 5. But a few rare individuals get to number 6. And this really almost appears to us, at least to me, as something desirable where, for his way of looking at things, is something that we should almost aspire to. And let's see what number 6 is all about in the next slide. A universalizing faith, the 6th and highest stage. This is a very rare stage, he says. What is this about? People who reach this, those rare and unusual heroes, feel a sense and act upon a spirit of an all-inclusive and fulfilled human community. You feel a sense of empathy with the average person in Africa and Europe and Antarctica, wherever it is. And your perspective is so broad that it embraces ultimately all human beings. And people who have this, he suggests, carry themselves. You can almost see their posture as they walk through the world, something physical, something in their conversation. These individuals have a special grace that makes them seem more lucid, more simple, not simplistic, but simple, and yet somehow more fully human than the rest of us. It's as if they've crossed the Rubicon, they've crossed some wilderness to get to the other side and have been burned by the fires of experience and have emerged with a glow about them. And I thought about this, the examples that he gives, Tolstoy, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. He suggests even Abraham Joshua Heschel in other writings, that there is something about these folks that is quite different than the average adherent or even an advanced adherent of one's religious faith. And so I thought about the implications of what he's saying. And I think that a part of it is that there is not necessarily any longer a specific claim by the religious tradition one has grown up with. No one is thereafter shackled by those teachings, but rather it's part of the fuel of the greater whole. And I thought about that in light of what we talked about in our first session, if you recall. By the way, we're going to follow the same format. So please, again, always feel free to put questions in chat. I will do my best to take them up if it works along the way, but perhaps most likely at the end of the time that we have. And I'll end early enough so that we can have some conversation in whatever the wonderful form that Zoom allows. And again, please feel free to continue to send your thoughts, your emails, your what's on your mind and what has been brought up by these sessions and what you would like to explore further. So we spoke about sort of this nature of a hyphenated identity, if you will. We are most of us, very comfortable, for the most part, as in this continent, as Americans, and comfortable to a varying extents as being Jews, though we're not clear necessarily that we all agree about what that means. And we have our concerns to be sure about both of them. But I don't think I know of anyone who would like to give either one of them up, certainly not those in present company. They are both a part of who we are. They seem to address each other. They're important to have a partnership. They talk to each other. And I don't think any one of us would necessarily want to feel that we would have to give up a tradition that says, which is the Jewish piece of us, that says, if you think about that key idea, that if I'm for myself alone, who am I? But at the same time, I must be for myself, because what will be if I am not? Who will be for me if I'm not for me, Jewishly speaking? But if I'm for myself alone, who am I? So it's almost as if the ideal, I think, from that kind of statement is, again, with the metaphor I use a lot, in that we are entitled to wear glasses, if you will, from a Jewish perspective that says there are things that we can and ought to look at through the lens of the Jewish enterprise, be it Jewish history, be it Jewish values, be it Jewish texts and ideas, and to say, here is an example where tikkun olam, we talked about last week, repair of the world, ought to come into play. Here is a place where the ideals of universal suffrage ought to come into place, because that is a Jewish ideal as well. And to see that these are not exclusive of each other, that we don't have to give up anything of our own tradition to do that. So I think that one of the things that makes this kind of exploration of identity interesting is that it encouraged one to think about where they might be along a continuum. But I think at the same time, it's useful to see if maybe because we are the kind of people that we are, we see things a little bit differently, even along the axis of do we believe or not believe. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is also the implication that I will just reinforce from what we've been talking about. You and I want to see things from a Jewish set of perspectives. Are we less developed somehow? Have we kind of stalled along the continuum of what a Fowler would say is growth along these lines? And I would like to suggest that, although this is an interesting perspective, this is not necessarily being less developed to say things the way we would often see them, but rather a suggestion that we are built, if you will, we are equipped to be able to have multiple experiences of truth from a variety of perspectives, and that the Jewish angle is something that is a very treasured part of how we might live our lives. Okay, go on to the next slide, please. Okay. So from the heights of academic kind of writing to a very clear and I would call it almost a gut kind of thing. I don't know how many of you have a certain kind of memory for Moshe Dayan. He had an interesting history, some of it a little checkered from the standpoint of his own experiences because he wasn't a perfect specimen of a moral person in every respect. Then again, I guess who is? But notice, you will, his years in the Israeli military um, as Minister of Defense. So he was very, very key to the experience of the Six-Day War in 1967, where he was terribly, terribly concerned about the threat against Israel. Was a very significant part of the engineering, the lightning victory of that year, and also the Yom Kippur War, which was a much, much more complex war. He gave, by the way, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but not hugely so, he gave a eulogy for a kibbutz member that was killed in a raid from Gaza, from Egypt and Gaza, at a certain point during this period, and was really very, very perceptive as to the nature of the ongoing painful need to defend and always have a staunch, vigilant military stance, as much as that was something that all would wish would not be the necessity, but he was very clear about it. So I raise this for two reasons. One is he certainly is not asking for religious faith. He's hardly a traditional Dati Orthodox Jew. But he's talking about something more primal in this. And yes, this was used for fundraising. And yes, this was used for shoring up support for Israel in the lands outside of the state of Israel. But he was pushing a button, if you will, that he believed would be effective. And I think it was very effective. All I ask is that you feel Jewish, undefined, undefined. Because it's an absolute follow-up to that. If you feel Jewish, you will do the right thing, you will step up and you will help. It's like you could not help yourself. You would have to do it because it was baked into the DNA of who you are. And I think that this might be one of those staunch expressions of this peoplehood idea that sometimes we've been even calling a kind of a puppy love, if you will, of our fellow Jews. We've been talking about it from the standpoint of being not only responsible for each other as a value, I'm guessing we've heard that before, but also bearing the burden of the other, because it's simply what Jews do at times of need. If I'm not mistaken, in the week after the October 7th war began, that we're still struggling to get to a point where, thank God, there's some movement on the hostages, and there's been a break in all of the hostilities. We hope that we can come to a conclusion very soon that will be to everyone's benefit, certainly. But we get those hostages home. We see that there was, and to a degree still is, an incredible, incredible outpouring that feels very, very almost nostalgic in a strange way of 1967 and those subsequent years. My numbers are correct. Park Avenue Synagogue, a single conservative synagogue in New York City, raised $18 million in a day for Israel. Now, even in a place that may have significant monetary kinds of resources, that's astounding. That is astounding. And one of the questions I ask, and I wonder sometimes if it's generational, if this is something that resonates with you, with people you know. If you walk through a day and you find something, a clip of a video, a piece of news, a talk with a friend, something you read, a conversation, all sorts of possibilities that makes you say, yes, that's me feeling Jewish right now. Does that give you something that is a source of identification of who you are that really doesn't require a whole lot of other explanation? It's just there. In a way, it's the anti-Fowler thing in terms of these gradations of faith, because you haven't necessarily had to do much or anything to grow into, because it's just been something that's been building over the years and now is an integral part of who you are. So I'm curious if this kind of approach, this gut feeling approach, resonates with you and the people that you know. So I would be curious to hear. Let's go on, please. One in the middle. There we go. Yep, there she is. Okay. I raised the Anne Frank experience and the diary of Anne Frank for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is of great significance that we observed, the world observed in the last couple of days, on Monday in particular, the whole International Holocaust Memorial Day. It's the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And in the course of that, too, we have had an opportunity to revisit something about the Anne Frank experience. You may know that some over 60% of Americans cannot identify what Auschwitz was. They have not heard of it. They have no idea what it is. So the Anne Frank experience, in many, many ways, I think, comes to be a statement of this line of identification with the question of how uniquely Jewish do we explain to ourselves and others are the experiences that we are talking about here. So on a few different levels. I don't know how many of you have had the chance to explore at some depth the diary, to read it from cover to cover. The next slide would be helpful just to see some of its physical appearance. It's not widely known, but she actually rewrote it. A lot of it was written during the time that she was in hiding over a period of 2 years, but she actually began to rewrite it because she wanted to get rid of the more childish pieces that she had in there, more personal pieces that she had in there when she was 13. And she already began to sense that this could be a work that would serve a cause beyond her. And her father, Otto Frank, would be certainly promoting of that as well. And the question became one of, to what extent is Anne Frank a uniquely Jewish experience, and how much is it a universal? We have seen her diary quoted for those who are concerned about the immigration policies that we're looking at now, where they are talking about what it means to be dragged out of one's house, summarily put into custody and placed into an unknown future. She was describing the Nazis in the Netherlands, but others are saying, no, this is our experience now as well that we have to look at. Nelson Mandela held up this book as a great exemplar of freedom in apartheid South Africa. Others throughout much of the world began to do the same thing over the course of time. And in its screen and its stage production, the Jewishness of Anne Frank, to a very significant degree, was downplayed in order to make it more appealing at a broader basis. I was just telling Nancy this the other day. I remember reading this when I was in, then I was junior high, but middle school. And it was such a powerful thing for us to read this as kids, Jewish and non-Jewish and so forth. But the thing that was, I had to correct my teacher because she took the Yiddishisms. When Anne would be called Annela, she didn't understand it, so she called her Annelle. That's how it was supposed to be pronounced. And I got to correct her. I felt very good about that. So this whole idea of the universal nature of this, it begs an interesting question. And that is, how do we explain, yes, to ourselves, but others, why the Holocaust matters to a world beyond the Jewish one? One could point to other terrible, terrible tragedies. Rwanda, in Cambodia, elsewhere. Some things that are unfolding today, perhaps on smaller scales, but are threatening to emerge and break into something more. Is it only because we want to have sympathy for Jews and people should know about that? But it's interesting because many Holocaust survivors, and we are the last generation to hear their testimonies, be witnesses, as Elie Wiesel so significantly says. Many of them will often talk about it as the standpoint of, here is my story, here is what happened because we were Jews and only because we were Jews. But they will also quite often pivot to a need to banish hatred at large. Be very careful about seeing this is not the only hatred in the world. So I think that when we're talking about Jewish identity and how it helps us to view the world at large and what our Judaism is as a result of that, a part of it really is based, I think, on how we understand the Holocaust and why should it matter to the world beyond. I have an answer that I think is significant. I do believe, this is just offering a perspective, that there is a core truth to the Miners Canary experience. World history has suggested often that Jews, when they begin to be persecuted, are very often not the last group to be persecuted. Those who would harm Jews are very, very comfortable going beyond the Jewish world to harm others, also whom they deem to be different. The dislike of the unlike, as we've talked about. And so it is in everybody's interest to understand. But I think that all of us would want to resist what is called the de-Judaizing of the word Holocaust. I have seen, and the experience of it, I have seen the word Holocaust applied to a lopsided score in a football game in all manner of concerns. It's been applied to the experience in Gaza, not genocide only, but Holocaust, which is a very painful thing for anybody in the Jewish world. So it is a very, very significant kind of experience. And here is a kicker. Here is a kicker because it goes to the heart of the Jewish identity piece as well. I don't know how many of you came across this story a couple of years ago, but like many, many Jewish places in Europe, Anne Frank Museum has a guard, and they hired a Jewish guard. The guard wanted to wear a kippah because that was his religious identity. And he was told by those who administer the museum, no, this is a museum for all, and we don't want this to be in any way threatening, or we don't want you as somebody here to represent something that will make others uncomfortable, or maybe it's a security risk. And the guard pushed back, and he said, basically, do you mean to tell me that the place that where the Frank family and a few others hid for 2 years because they were Jewish can't have a security guard outside that openly identifies as Jewish? So 6 months later, he was the guard, his kippah went back up. But it's grist for that now. So one thing I just want to conclude with Anne Frank, and that is the most famous line from the diary. Again, it's a universal one. She said, along the lines of, deeply within, I believe that all people, deep in their hearts, are fundamentally good. And she wrote this while still in hiding. I've always wondered that when she was ultimately deported to the concentration camp, would she still have written? I'll leave it for you to think about yourselves. Okay, onward, please. Okay, I just want to explore for a little bit the experience of both ideas to an extent and also vehicles for how we might understand ourselves and how to approach it, assuming we would like to join with others, or we would like to base our understanding on things in the past. I say this once upon a time, a little tongue-in-cheek, because we're still with it to an extent, but there were the denominations. What kind of person are you? What kind of Jew are you? Very often it would say, well, I'm conservative because I go to a conservative congregation, Orthodox Reform, or any fewer in number reconstructions. And that's how I sort of saw myself. And it wouldn't necessarily line up that one has read 83 articles about what those various denominations believe in, but this was kind of a catch-all. This is where I feel comfortable, whichever one you choose. This is where I want to make my religious home. And that held forth for many decades as being a fundamental kind of address. And when you got to college campuses, there were Hillel houses. On most campuses, there's Chabad. Sometimes they work together nicely, sometimes they don't. But they're still there in most major universities. And the fraternities and sororities who often have a very nice and close relationships with the other ones, and you could find Jewish groupings there. So that was kind of something you could count. And now, oh my goodness, we have the Chavurot, small groups that come together for study, for prayer, for all sorts of things. Minions that are prayer groups that are only for women so they can explore their spirituality only as women, largely in the Orthodox world. Independent minyanim. There are many throughout the country. A lot of them, I would say even most of them, to my knowledge, will not identify formally with the conservative movement, though they are very largely made up of conservative raised Jews. They just don't want to have the label because this is a group getting away from labels. But they're egalitarian, they're quite traditional, and they are very serious in their pursuit of prayer, and they're small communities, but they're serious in their pursuit of prayer and study. Renewal minyanim are very often tied in quite a bit with progressive political stances, and have created a wealth of very interesting and new music, and are to be found in mostly major cities around the country. What is a partnership minyan? It is a pushing of the boundaries in the Orthodox world, where there will be separate seating for men and women, but they will not start until both 10 men and 10 women are there. Women are allowed to do various things, lead services, read Torah, and so forth. But they maintain a separation of seating. And it's a very interesting pushing of the boundaries. And when I say millennial and Gen Z oriented online resources, you could spend the rest of your life looking at what's available online for resources and not exhaust it. And then things that have nothing to do necessarily with a specific group that meets all the time, but something along the lines of one table Shabbat groups, where you bring together usually millennials in a large city. They come together, they meet in a central place. Sometimes it's a restaurant, sometimes it's a bar. One I came across in Chicago had a Shabbat dinner in a restaurant across the street from Wrigley Field, and they went afterwards to a Cubs game because they were playing Friday night, and that was right across the street. So they can get. And by the way, this is not being sponsored by anybody other than, they get money sometimes from grants, but this is sponsored by everyone bottom up coming together and trying to make this happen. It's very spontaneous. Many ways of doing this. And that's become a variety of ways of exploring Jewish identity in ways and places that otherwise might never happen. And I think for that, it's only to be applauded. Now, what's the issue with the experience of denominations? The next slide. Despite the rather demure appearance and traditional appearance of Rabbi Yitzchak Greenberg, he is the father of religious pluralism. Very interesting and unique Orthodox rabbi who believes that each of the denominations have things within them that are negative. That's why he tongue-in-cheek has said, I don't care what you're a part of as long as you're ashamed of it. Quotable quote, if ever there was one. But how do we come together to talk to each other so that we don't have two Jewish peoples or three Jewish peoples? And how do we learn from each other? How do we gain perspective? Part of what is driving things like this is the reality that the major Jewish approaches, Chabad, Reform Judaism, what's called Neo-Orthodoxy, Conservative Judaism, in their initial formulations are 200 years old now. And how are we supposed to see them in different potential lights and see our lives in different potential lights unless we kind of mix up the batter a little bit and see something from a different perspective, just as we are free to do in our own ways. It says tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's very clear. What are we a part of? We're part of a Mosaic tradition. What's Mosaic about it? Moses. What's also Mosaic about it? It's lots of little pieces that come together to create the whole portrait. And that becomes our prerogative. And I think it's not always easy to navigate, but I think our way. Next slide, please. I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit. I can hear the clock ticking. This is something that Greenberg said. Now, this is more radical than it might seem. He wants to suggest that the message to modernity from God, as it were, is that God is withdrawing from the world. That's why our prayers sometimes seem like they're not answered. That's why terrible things have happened in the world, because the only way for humans to take full responsibility, to be part of the covenant, fuller partners in the covenant, is to say, okay, God, you're becoming more hidden, and that was what allows us to come closer again, because you human beings are picking up the slack. We have to do that. Now, I'm not arguing that he's right or he's wrong. That's not the point. The point is that we have people who are coming from traditions that would seem to be traditionally very pious, saying, wait a minute, how do we begin to explain things that have a stake in tradition, but also respect human beings, respect Jews, respect the intelligence and lived experience of people, to be able to say, wait a minute, some of the older formulations of what Jewish experiences have been all about are a problem. What can I explore to make it more of an idea, an approach that I can grasp, so I can say this is a part of my Jewish identity? Okay, onward, please. It goes without saying, I think, I hope, that now for several decades, the egalitarian impulse in traditional and modern and increasingly in more traditional Jewish life has taken hold as a given. Doesn't mean it's come to fruition. But with like first generation Jewish feminists like Judith Plasko, who says basically we have to revisit Sinai, not because she wants to rewrite the Torah, but because she wants to see where women have and women's voices have been underemphasized, privileged, and misunderstood, and to give them a much greater voice is a crucial and absolute necessity of modern life. We're not going to disenfranchise 52% of the Jewish population. This was actually part of our discussion in Tuesday's Lunch and Learn class by a barely noted but very key part of the book of Genesis, a nurse by the name of Deborah, whose demise from this world is actually a very significant episode. So women in particular are still looking for and finding their voices in ways that are of enrichment for us all. I often wonder, when we ask the questions that we've been asking, what does Judaism look like to me from my identity vantage point? I wonder how it might potentially differ for men and women based on the experiences they had. And I'm always curious to hear how much of an experience that has been. Another set of ideas. On to the next one, please. Okay, I wanted to bring this for two reasons, three really. Shai Held is, in my mind, one of the great thinkers of modern Jewish life. We have had a tie with him personally in this congregation because he was a good friend of Matthew Eisenfeld and Sarah Duker of blessed memory, part of that age in that class. And he also writes about Matt and Sarah in his book, this book that I urge you really, really to read. And I would, if I wasn't asked to, so I couldn't, but if I were to take an underlining to this book, I think that what would be emphasized is the second word in the title. Judaism is about love. Now, why does he write a multi-hundred-page book about this with a zillion footnotes? I urge you to read it, just put aside some significant time to do so. And that is because of the stereotype that the entire, and sometimes from the Christian world and sometimes from the Jewish world, it's only about justice. Jews are all about the strict adherence to norms of what is just in the world and what is the right thing to do, what are purposes that need to be served by correct laws and correct behavior. But he does a really superb job in elucidating the very fundamental core that on so many different levels, biblical, later than biblical materials, later than that, up until today, the core experience of what being a Jew is all about ought to be seen as imitating the core element of what he understands God to be about, which is the pursuer of goodness, pursuer of kindness, the pursuer of love. And I'm not going to obviously make the whole case here, but part of opening our minds and hearts to an identity that is different is to be able to say, really, I never thought of it that way, that maybe there is another angle that could well be explored. So I bring that idea to you as well. And then we have some techniques. Next slide, if we could. You may think, especially given the graphic, that we are talking about taking everybody on a Buddhist retreat, and we're going to have Thich Nhat Hanh speak to us, and with a little side trip to see the Dalai Lama. But what I think people don't realize is that there's a very rich tradition in Jewish meditation on all sorts of different levels. Aryeh Kaplan, no longer alive, sadly, is an Orthodox rabbi, and he pulls from the Jewish tradition on all sorts of levels. How indeed there are multiple forms of meditative experience to do the kinds of things we talk about for stress reduction, for mindfulness building, but also for a growing closer attachment to the divine. It's not sitting in a service where we know pretty much and expect certain things to happen because we've been there before. It's a very different awareness and a change of consciousness. Very quick example, instead of Om as a mantra, one would recite, in this case, maybe Shema Yisrael, or another passage. Could be done in Hebrew, could be done in English. People have different experiences with Yiddish pronunciation or modern Hebrew pronunciation, but it is a bona fide attempt on the part of a tradition to be able to say, here's another technique to open, and what is my identity with this? Part of my identity with this, one might say, is that my Jewish experience is that of what allows me to feel a sense of stillness, openness, and a capacity to receive spirituality in a somewhat non-conventional way. This too is an end. And onward. Okay, I bring this for a couple of quick reasons. I don't know how many of you have ever come across this little story. I feel from time to time I pay a little honor to a part of my own personal background, though we joke a fair amount about Minnesota and white bread and mayonnaise and those kinds of things. Nonetheless, it also allowed me to have some reasonably significant contact with Native Americans in school, going into the college years, and their experiences and their culture. And I've explored it from time to time because I found it to be incredibly rich. So though I know more about Lakota Sioux and the Chippewa tribes than I do about Cherokee, nonetheless, there's something Jewish about this as well. So we may have encountered in our own experience that there are two impulses, Jewishly speaking, in us. They're not wolves. They're called the Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara, in this case, is equivalent in many respects to the evil wolf. Jealousy, anger, greed, resentment, inferiority, lies, and ego. The good one, joy, peace, love, hope, all of these wonderful things. And here is the key thing. Which one wins? Almost invariably, it's the one that you feed, or feed the most. And that involves a consciousness of, and a very, very deep awareness of the fact that a Jewish pathway is to have a kind of very, very intense focus on what we might call our internal, but expressed behaviorally, world of personal morality. A key verse in that regard is the next slide. One back. There we go. So this is in the book of Psalms. Who is the person who desires life? It's twofold. What do you need to do to move forward in life? The first stage is a negative one. You turn away from evil. Say, this is bad. I'm not going to bite on this. I'm not going to go down this path. I know it leads to ruin for myself and perhaps for others. And there can be obvious things in terms of associating with people who will lead you into crime or addictions or into Lord knows what. And then it's turning the other way, the good wolf, if you will, who actively seek peace, actively seek the good that then yields a certain kind of peace. So it's almost in two stages to avoid that which is negative and that which is good. And then it gets, in the tradition that we're talking about, it gets very detailed. Next slide, please. So people who follow this would say, these are the midot, the character traits. I took a small selection of what are at least 48 of them. There's plenty to work on. One could work on these for the rest of one's life. And there are techniques for doing so, so that, and we're not talking about in society as a whole in some theoretical, abstract way. We're talking about the things that we identify in ourselves. These are religious imperatives, if you will, ethical imperatives, where one could be more compassionate, where one is not taking the stances that one ought to in life. We're not talking about standing on picket lines necessarily. We're talking about daily decisions, decisiveness, hope, joy, bringing joy into a person's life or others. All of these and many others are part of a fabric, if you will, where one who is concerned about how to live a Jewish life with an identity that is meaningful would see Judaism as a fabric of clear and abundant reminders of how to live in a not only aware kind of, but in ways that very, very clearly say that we can be agents for personal good in the world by working on ourselves. This is not a pursuit of happiness. I hesitate to, I need to say, it's not just going for happiness as much as that's important and getting rid of sadness and that kind of thing. In a way, it's a byproduct of doing some of this work that one very often might find meaning and happiness as a result. So yet another avenue. Okay, let's go on. I just want to conclude with two kinds of things. I've asked myself a lot, is there a single pathway that might well give us a sense of what could unite all of these things together? What could unite all of these things on the 12 original things on the slide? The techniques we've been talking about, the ideas we've been talking about. And I think there are two. And one is really a worldview that I think many of us might see with result, or expressed rather in this story. I think it's familiar to some people. We actually read it quite a bit in our services during the week, sometimes on Shabbat morning. A piece of history, the temple's destroyed after hundreds of years of offering animal sacrifices. What do? Give up and say, we'll fight another day? Or we'll rebel against Rome and once more and get clobbered by doing so? How about switching gears and going to a place called Yavne and setting up a school there and then realizing there's a different path? Rabbi Joshua's fear, the place which atoned for the sins of Israel through the ritual of animal sacrifice lies in ruins. And Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no, wait a minute. There's another way. You gain atonement. You do all of the things that we are talking about where you can do them anywhere you live. In North Carolina and in Brazil and in the land of Israel or wherever you are, you gain atonement through deeds of loving kindness. You grow Jewishly through study, through prayer, all of the other kinds of building blocks. And you realize that your tradition is broad enough, has broad enough shoulders to carry you, to be able to empower you to do things so you don't have to sit back and just wait. That activist approach, I think, is crucial. And especially, I love this even more than the first one. Yochanan ben Zakkai, the same one. What is more important than the ultimate redemption of the world? Well, be careful of gurus, be careful of false messiahs, be a little suspect, but keep on planting. If you are planting a sapling and are told the Messiah is here, okay, great. But first, finish your planting. Keep on planting. I think it's fair to say that as much as one might anticipate an ultimate redemption, we know that in the meantime, there are seeds to plant, and we ought to do so. And as a result of that, there's one more commonality. This says something that has been called by a few writers here and in Israel, the intergenerational quiz. And I just brought one example. I'm guessing some of us have seen this before in the Passover Haggadah. Just one example of it. If your child asks you tomorrow, what are the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances which the Lord our God has commanded you? Even if you take God out of the equation, this is the core of Jewish life. This is the thing that more than anything else has allowed us to even have these conversations. It's a sense that Jewish knowledge matters. For some, it's only about Bible and Talmud. I believe it's expanded into history and music and art and a variety of things where we all plug in. But the question is, how will we educate ourselves? Not only for ourselves, but for the next generation. So that when somebody asks us, what is this all about? What is it all about? We'll have an answer. And when we can answer this for ourselves, it becomes a dialogue that begins with, here's what it means to me. Let's talk about it. And I have been really, really moved in so many ways. You get into a room with people from Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, none of the above, secular, atheist kinds of backgrounds. Is there a common denominator when that happens, where somebody can say, let's do an activity where everybody is okay doing something without offending some issue or another? And the answer almost overwhelmingly is to learn Jewish texts, to learn Jewish ideas, to learn together and fight about it a little bit and argue about it a little bit, to say, I don't see it that way, and you push back, but there's a common denominator. There's a beginning. So we close with two thoughts. The next slide, if you would, please. So I asked this the first session, the story of Shammai. Teach me Torah al regel achat, while standing on one foot. Hillel is more generous in the personality, but he says, he has one, here's mine. What's hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That's the whole Torah. All of the rest is commentary. Zil Gemor, go and learn it. And so I'll revisit the question. Do you have a starting point? Do we have a starting point? Our own personal definition of what's important to us Jewishly, how we see ourselves, and also, as a result, our definition of Judaism. And if we can continue that exploration and that approach, I think we might see ourselves doing something ultimately interesting, which the last slide exemplifies. Yes, that is, thank you, but that's not quite the last slide. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. You may remember this. This is from our first class. The blue is a tiny amount of text from the book of Genesis, surrounded by commentary. Guess what? Very little agreement in all of the commentaries of these classic individuals who lived in the Middle Ages about what is important there, what something means. But I bring this to us at the end of our 3 sessions here to say that in a way that might be very literal, or maybe not quite so literal, we are the ongoing commentary around the text. All of us are invited to, if not write it, to speak it, to explore it, to explain what we see there. And each of these individuals have their own biographies, and they speak from their own biographies and their own life experiences. And we should feel free to do the same, and to see that this journey is ongoing, hopefully very enriching, very meaningful, and ultimately a blessing to us, and helps, something that builds communities for us, and something that really touches our hearts. And with that, now we can go to the last slide. And I say thank you. Thank you for the honor and the privilege of spending this time with you for this exploration, which I hope you have found to be meaningful. So with that, we have a few minutes at least for some questions, thoughts, alternate presentations, or whatever you would like to spend a couple minutes doing. Oh, there you all are. Okay, nice to see you all. It's the downside of sharing a screen, because I can't see you in the course of time. Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate that. Roberta, you have something that you would like to say. Please do so.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to say thank you so much. What you do for us is you open our minds to things we didn't know we could even think about and accept. And I think that's a gift you give us, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I can only say the same in return. This is mind expanding and soul expanding for me too, to hear your thoughts, to learn with you, because it's always the best way to expand for everybody to have a feeling for what important things mean to us all. Okay. All right.
You know what?
I
I'm going to
appreciate it.
ask you
Thank
a
you so
question,
much.
Rabbi.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
How much of what we've talked about, how much of Judaism do you think is inward versus outward?
Could you just explain a bit more about what
You
you
know, there's work to be done inward, study, personal growth, personal work. And there is in the community and being present and visible. But kind of how do you balance that?
I think it's really, really a great question. There's no question in my mind that there is a very, very strong link in the Jewish experience between personal experience and thoughts and emotion and behavior. Judaism's a pretty behavioral system, traditionally, right? It's the question of, looking the other day at laws about tzedakah and the debate about what percentage one should be giving to tzedakah. But the point is not how does one feel when one gives tzedakah, when the issue is what really is necessary and what should you be striving for. So you strive for something and you realize you're trying to help people who otherwise wouldn't have the help, but it also does something for you. It's reciprocal. It goes into a self-reinforcing loop. I think it's not a question of percentage as much as it is what is going to be the most helpful starting point for someone. For someone to roll up their sleeves and say, I need to get out there and do something because BJ's on. So I need to knit something for people who are in great need and then give that to them so that people who wouldn't otherwise have this Afghan or this creation are going to have that. And how wonderful that feels. And now I know that what I'm doing is reinforcing a Jewish value. And for other people who are more philosophically oriented or a little bit more quiet or just feel more comfortable with this contemplative kind of time, you understand, okay, here's the centrality of like Shai Held's stuff about loving kindness. I actually heard him say this. I'm a philosophically oriented person and I could write about and speak about loving kindness all day long. But then you know what? I got to get out there and get to see these people, these homeless people on New York streets, and I got to do something. And he has to push himself because that's not his natural inclination. So I think that ultimately we're talking about growing a soul, if you will, inside of us, and growing a community and growing a disposition that says, let's link the impulse to the action.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will give a little quick shout out to another class that is starting. It's a class in Thursdays, February and March, except for March 13th when we're going to all celebrate Purim together. But Rabbi Zarin and Rabbi Deborah Cantor are co-teaching a class called God is Here. And it's exploring a hands-on at times exploration of metaphors for the divine. And so if you are in West Hartford, it will be, I think it's going to be a pretty cool series. They'll be doing some art and in a hands-on way with over at B'nai Tepa Shalom. I know some of you are registered, but if you need more information, I will include it when I send out the recording of this class tomorrow. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lydia.